Hey guys, welcome. My name is Mark Catelli. I'm with Couple of Fern, Florida Native Plant Society. I will go through my announcements briefly and then hand things over to Brandon Corder, our presenter for this evening pertaining to Florida's native orchids. So welcome to Couple of Fern. Our mission, perennial mission, is the conservation, preservation, and restoration of Florida native plants and native plant communities. While we are here, please go to youtube.com/coupleoffern. So do it now before we forget, youtube.com/coupleoffern, and click subscribe. Our page looks like this. The subscribe button is right here on the top right corner. It says subscribe. So please go ahead and subscribe. Your subscription is free, and it's a free way to support us, and we would be very grateful for that. So please go ahead and subscribe while I have your attention. youtube.com/coupleoffern. Members, if you are a Couple of Fern member, or if you're a Florida Native Plant Society member, you can report your monthly volunteer hours at this time. If you're viewing this presentation on a screen, such as a tablet or the TV perhaps, you can just pull up your smartphone, point to the QR code, and the QR code should pull up the volunteer hour form, and go ahead and just report your hours. It usually takes me less than 15 seconds to report it. Educational hours is a category, so select that, and tonight's program will probably be about an hour to an hour and a half, and you can easily report that in the future as well. In case you don't know, we are in the process of marketing and advertising for the Native Florida license plate. We need to hit a certain count by next year in October, and then the license plates will start to be minted out. So if you are interested in supporting Native Plant Society, our organization has been around for 40 plus years. And if you are a longtime member, or if you have a loved one that you'd like to gift this, please go to fnps.org/support/license, and that will give you all the information you need to sign up for this. Again, these are all pre-sale vouchers. The license plates will be confirmed next October 2022. You can also point your smartphone to the QR code in the bottom right corner, and that will route you to the same website that is listed below. And don't forget, our fall plant sale is coming up. This is September 25th, which is not this upcoming Saturday, but the following Saturday. It's at the Sanford Garden Club, 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. This is likely to be our final plant sale of the year. We're not sure. We may have another opportunity, but it's looking like it's going to be the final plant sale of the year. And believe it or not, Couple of Fern has accomplished 5 native plant sales this year. So it's a huge accomplishment for our chapter. And we have mastered it down to a science. So it's 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. If you are a Couple of Fern member, and if you want to become a Couple of Fern member, you should know that Couple of Fern members enjoy pre-sale orders. So you guys can select and put down plants on your wish list, so that way you can obtain them at the plant sale before anybody else. They're basically marked off for you. Again, September 25th, Sanford Garden Club, 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. So next month is October Native Plant Month. We have a lot going on. And when I mean a lot, I mean a lot. So, part of my passion has always been to really celebrate native plants. And when Native Plant Month became a thing, I decided to just pursue it and, collaborate and get as many people excited as I was. So, I'm very grateful for the native plant enthusiasts that have banded around this cause. So let me go through all of these experiences with you really briefly. The first one is September 26th. So we're actually jumping right before October, and we're doing a free virtual experience with the Native Plant Gardening Group on Facebook. It's called the Florida Native Plant Gardening Group, and we're doing a free virtual live stream with them, which is called Get to Know Florida Native Plant Society and Couple of Fern. It'll be through our YouTube channel as well, so you can catch that through YouTube, or you can catch that through the Florida Native Gardening Facebook page, which will be live streamed to as well. It's free. It's at 5 p.m. and that's Sunday, September 26th. October 5th, we're actually catering to our Latinx community. So we're doing plantas nativas en la cocina latina, basically, which means native plants in the Latino cuisine. It's virtual, it's free, it's at 12 p.m. That will be live streamed through the Florida Native Plant Society YouTube channel, as well as a few other outlets. Again, that's October 5th. I believe that's a Tuesday, and it'll be at noon. So you can catch this during your lunch break, or you can revisit it after it is available through our YouTube playlist. Our in-person programs, our in-person meetings are resuming, the very first one being Couple of Fern at the Enchanted Forest. This is a field trip. Native Plant Society members, Couple of Fern members will actually get notifications of this so that they can sign up for it before the general public does. October 10th, in person, 9 a.m., and that's in Titusville. We're doing a virtual class, again, with Nita Villalobos-Bell. Some of you know her from New Year, New Garden, or identifying oak trees and oak species in Central Florida. She's done a few virtual experiences with us. Her next one is seeds collecting, storage, and planting. It'll be virtual. It's ticketed through Zoom, and it's at 11 a.m., and that's October 16th, which I believe is a Saturday. So more information will be available to you via Facebook, our website, fnps.org, and several other media channels. Our next in-person gathering is actually a botany chalk event. So we're kind of doing the Rebel route, where we're chalking the walkways of Spring Hammock with Latin names of native as well as invasive or problematic species that are non-native. It's in person. More information will be available about that online. That's October 23rd at 9 a.m., and that's a Saturday. The next day, Sunday, we're doing a field trip in person at Lake Louisa State Park. So we're doing a tram ride with them, and that's going to be a group excursion, and we'll be trammed all around the property. I believe it'll be around 8:30 a.m. We'll probably start around 9, and we'll be done by 1, and more information will be available online about that as well. Central Florida SISMA, which is the Cooperative of Invasive Species Management Authority, is doing a webinar, and I believe 150 plus people have already signed up for this webinar. They have a capacity of 500 viewers if you want to sign up, so there is room for you to register. It is on the world of invasive insects, October 28th, which is Tuesday. It'll be virtual. You need to sign up. Information is already available through our Facebook page. You can sign up and register with the link provided there. It's free. It's from 8:30 in the morning until 12:45 in the afternoon. Again, October 28th, I believe that is a Thursday. And all month, we're doing a photo series, courtesy of tonight's presenter, Brandon Corder. So he has provided us with a trove of beautiful native orchids and some naturalized and one invasive orchid that we will be showcasing all month through Facebook and Instagram. So each day will be dosed with a particular orchid that will be showcased and some information about it, just to get you to celebrate Florida Native Plant Month with us, just be amazed by the diversity of orchids that are found in our state, and really showcase and highlight the importance of conservation that revolves around our beloved native plants. So a couple of fern members, what does it take to become a couple of fern member? You either are in the Central Florida area, we specialize or we directly serve the North Orlando metropolitan area residents. So Altamont, Longwood, all of Seminole County, Apopka that bleeds into Seminole County, Winter Park that bleeds into Seminole County. Winter Park residents sometimes happen to be Seminole County residents. All of West Volusia, that's our direct service region. So in case you happen to be in the North Orlando metropolitan area, you belong with Couple of Fern, that is our direct service area. Or if you happen to be just exclusive distance learners, people that don't have a lot of time to make a difference locally, they want to stay involved with continuing education opportunities such as this, and they are exclusive distant learners because of that, then you can become a Couple of Fern member as well. For example, we have a member out in Pennsylvania, and tonight, Brandon out in Wisconsin is also a Couple of Fern member. So come grow with us, see native plants like never before. These are just some of the things that we do. We do events, we do workshops, community gardening. We have different demonstration gardens across Central Florida that we can help you learn about native plant care firsthand. Workshops like NIDAs that are occurring throughout the year. Events like plant sales, environmental study areas is what we do. We're still on target for our December holiday party social in person. So if you're looking for that in-person experience, that warm social gathering, fingers crossed, hopefully things subside with the pandemic, and we are on target still for meeting in person in December for the holiday party. We're back at field trips, so we just went over that. So we're doing a field trip at Lake Louisa State Park. We're doing a field trip at the Enchanted Forest. So come and explore natural ecosystems and their conservation value with us. We do a lot of virtual learning. Couple of Fern is known for virtual learning. So webinars, webisodes, tons of special experiences. I could go on and on about those. Internships. Our internship program is now in its second year. So we're instilling the love and importance of nature with future generations. So come become a member with us. So you go to fnps.org, you click on join, or it says support. Student, individual, household, business level memberships that are available. Choose which one is right for you and select Couple of Fern. The form looks like this, so it's fnps.org, and then when you click on join, you can click on Couple of Fern right from the drop-down box, which is right here. It's simple as that. And without further ado, I would love for you guys to give a warm welcome to Brandon Corder, a wonderful gentleman, Florida native, true and true. Right now is pursuing his PhD out in Wisconsin, but please welcome Brandon.
Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me okay, Mark?
Yes, crystal clear.
Okay, great. Before I start, I just want to say thanks again for the opportunity. This is my second time speaking with the Couplet Fern folks, and I always get to enjoy at the beginning all the neat things that your group is putting on. I'm just so thankful that Florida has such a strong base of folks who are interested in plants. So that's a really great thing to get involved in. So thanks for having me. So I will share my screen now.
Yeah, and Brandon, tell us a little bit about yourself before you start too.
Yeah, of course. So I am as Mark mentioned, I'm a Florida native. Grew up in the Daytona Beach area in Palm Coast, Flagler County. Did my undergrad at the University of Florida. So really, the first 2 decades plus of my life, I spent living in Florida and enjoying all the native plants in Florida. And, ever since I was a kid, I was actually interested in plants. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But finally, in 2018, I moved on to the University of Wisconsin. I'm working on my PhD here, studying orchids. Not any particular focus in terms of area. I guess you could say North America or specifically the Great Lakes. But I'm specifically interested in how orchids and fungi associate and the evolution of the orchid family kind of from a genome sense. But in my free time, I also am just a really big plant watcher. And I found that the orchids are some of the most rewarding plants to watch and to go looking for. So that's going to be kind of my lead into this. Now,
Awesome.
the last time that I gave a talk on mosses, I believe I had my pantry behind me. So this time I actually brought my entire lab room at the University of Wisconsin. So a little bit more sciencey looking, maybe. Okay. So yeah, my talk today is entitled Florida's Orchids, and I gave it kind of a purposefully vague title or a very general title because at first I kind of went into it thinking, it might be interesting to give a really wide encompassing view of a lot of different aspects of orchid biology. But as I kind of got more into it, one thing kind of stuck out to me, which was just how special Florida is in the context of the entire United States for its orchid flora. So that's the direction that I kind of started to coalesce into. So I also want to say that all of the photos that I'll be using today are mostly my own photos. I also tossed in a couple pictures that my dad, Jeff Porter, has taken over his time being interested in orchids. And if there's any other photos in here I used, you can see at the bottom who took them. There's some really talented orchid photographers out there we're lucky to have. I kind of want to go in two parts. First is just giving a little bit of background on orchids. So I find that a lot of people are interested in orchids, growing orchids at home, and maybe occasionally looking for some of our native orchids. But I did want to get a little bit into some of the aspects of the orchid biology, talk a little bit about the importance of Florida's orchids, and then maybe set a little bit of a groundwork on taxonomy of orchids, because I think that if you use the biology and the taxonomy lens to look at our local flora, that only makes it even more rewarding what we actually will find when we start to peek a little bit closer at the components of our orchids. After that, I'm going to give a little bit of a by the numbers. So talk a little bit about the number of species we have, the endemic species introduced, and other things like that. I want to talk a little bit about their biogeographic affinities. So where are these orchids coming from? And then we'll get into some very quick profiles of some of the species and genera that we have in Florida. Now, this might be getting to the punchline a little bit early, but we have over 100 species of orchids in Florida, over 100 species in Florida. So there's no way that I'm able to cover all of them. So at the end, I'm going to point you to some other resources for you to explore all the ones I didn't get to a little bit more yourself, okay? And again, my goal is just for you all to have an appreciation of how unique the orchid flora of Florida is in the context of the US flora. Okay, so I already kind of talked a little bit about me. I graduated from UF in 2018. I'm now at the Department of Botany at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I got into orchids because my dad was an orchid lover. He was a native plant lover, and him and I still go out looking for orchids all the time. This is me with some Platanthera nivea, the snowy orchis. Here's my dad with his own Platanthera as well. This was in Nassau County a couple years ago. And I also want to give a shout out to the Cameron Lab. Ken Cameron is my advisor here. He's an orchid systematist interested in the evolution of the vanilla family. Grad school, it's really great to get deep into all the science and everything. So thanks, Ken, for taking me on. And let's just kind of get started with just the biggest thing. What is an orchid? And I actually get this question a lot from people, like, what makes an orchid an orchid? So the simplest way to explain that would be just to say that an orchid is something that is in the orchid family. And, all the orchids would share a common ancestor. And we have about 25,000 species of orchids. That number changes depending on who you ask, but I like to go with 25,000. One of the coolest things about the orchids are just how many different forms we have. We have orchids with huge flowers, little flowers, every color you can imagine, epiphytic, living on trees, terrestrial, living in the ground, lithophytic, on rocks, semi-aquatic. All of those we have in Florida as well. Now, these numbers I'm going to give for some of the numbers of orchid species in different places. I want you to keep in the back of your head this kind of touchstone. Okay, so there are 500 mammal species about in the United States. There's about 1,000 or 1,100 bird species in the United States. Okay, so keep those numbers in the back of your head. Colombia alone has 4,000 species of orchids. Ecuador, 4,000 species of orchids. Malaysia, 2,500 for Brazil, 1,500 for Panama, Mexico, Australia. In the United States, we have 200 species of orchids found here. So orchid diversity is the greatest in the tropics and the subtropics, but really they get all over the entire world. So how do you recognize an orchid? Orchids have a familiar kind of floral morphology to them. So I have this picture of the Phalaenopsis or moth orchid, one of the common ones that you might find in the store. There are 3 petals, 2 on the side and 1 that is modified very heavily into a lip. And then there are 3 sepals in the back, 2 lateral and 1 dorsal. There's something called a column. This is a unique thing for orchids and a couple other groups of plants where the pollen producing and the egg containing parts are kind of combined together into something called a column. In order to prevent them from self-fertilizing, there's something called a rostellum or beak. And another interesting thing about them is they have a special type of pollen that's kind of clustered together into a big clump called a pollinium. Okay. But it's not just all in the flowers of the orchid that make them unique. There's a lot of aspects of other parts of their biology as well. So orchids have extremely tiny seeds. On the left, here's a picture I took of an orchid that's found in Wisconsin called a plectrum. This is taken with a microscope. I would have to look up exactly what the magnification is, but they're like dust. They lack any food inside of the seed, and they only contain an embryo inside. So since they have no food, orchids are highly dependent on fungi to get started and germinate, which is kind of what I'm studying. In the middle, I have some pictures of what the baby orchids look like. And on the right, this is just exhibiting exactly how specific that relationship with fungi are. So this is a cross-section of a root of a coral root orchid. And you can see inside of there, all of those little beige-looking things are fungal coils. So those are fungi from the outside world that have infiltrated the orchid. They make these little coils called pelotons, and the orchid can digest those to take some carbon from them or other nutrients. So orchids are a little bit of plants on the dark side. They kind of are exploiting fungi. It's a very interesting aspect of their biology. Okay, so why are we interested in Florida's orchids specifically? Why did I choose to talk about that tonight? Well, first, every county of Florida has native orchids, and some people are surprised to hear about that. Florida has more orchid species than any other state. So we have about 121 species of orchid found in Florida. The next closest is 71 for North Carolina. where I am in Wisconsin and in Michigan, there's about 55 to 57. California has 40, and Hawaii only has 3 native species of orchid, which is very surprising. And not only looking at the states, but also looking at the other territories of the United States, we also have a comparable number of orchids to places like Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, which have about 140 species. And remember, those are situated in the tropics, which have the highest orchid diversity. Florida has arguably the richest taxonomic diversity of orchids for any US state, and I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more, what I mean by that. And looking at just the epiphytic orchids, the orchids that grow on trees, almost all of them, as far as the United States flora is concerned, are restricted to Florida. So if you look at the United States and see we have this many epiphytic orchids, about 30, almost all of them are found in Florida and nowhere else in the United States. And really important as well is that almost 63% of Florida's orchid species are listed as being threatened or endangered in the state, which is a very high proportion considering there's 120 species. But I also think that orchids just capture the imagination like very few other plants do. Just in my 26 years on Earth, everything I've learned about the orchids, there's so much controversy, excitement, adventure, legend that I've found really nowhere else in the plant world. It's really spectacular. So the Orchids of Florida have been depicted in books and in movies. So if you haven't seen Adaptation with Nick Cage and Meryl Streep, focusing on the Fakahatchee strand of South Florida, then you absolutely need to. The orchid world of Florida has its own legendary figures. Carlisle Lure, who was a doctor and also an orchid aficionado. He has the Bible for the Florida orchids, the native orchids of Florida. Good luck finding that for cheap on the internet, but keep your eye out, okay? So yeah, I just think that there's so much excitement in the orchids of Florida. Okay, so let's get into some of the summaries of Florida's orchids. Let's go by the numbers. So I should put a couple of disclaimers on here that you will get as many guesses for numbers of species of orchids as you ask, as the number of people you ask, okay? There is a lot of different estimates out there, and it's changing as the taxonomy changes. So species get new names. One species gets split by taxonomists into multiple species, or maybe you have 2 species that we now consider the same thing. The number changes a lot. So I did have to kind of, pick a number, and I'm going with Alan Weekly's Flora of the Southeastern States, which came out last year from the University of North Carolina. Alan Weekly is a great taxonomist. And according to his study of the flora of Florida, he has 123 orchid taxa present or historical, which includes species and accepted varieties, but not hybrids or forms or other things like that. If you were to dissect that a little bit more, you'll see that 89% of them are native, and that accounts for 109 native orchid taxa, which is over half of the number of species found in the United States. So going through our native orchids, about five or six of them are endemic, which means that they are found nowhere else other than Florida. As I was saying, about 63% of them are state listed as threatened or endangered. 0 of them, however, are listed as federally endangered or federally threatened. So this is all at the state level. 52% are represented in the United States orchid flora only in Florida. So again, if you were to look at the entire country, if you were to take all the orchids that live in the United States, 52% of those species do not occur outside of Florida. Now, they might occur in other countries, but we're just looking at the United States flora for this. And also about 7 of them are extirpated or locally extinct. And several more of them are either dubious to have ever occurred in Florida, or they may have been reported only once and never seen again. We'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. I also wanted to go through and use the Florida Plant Atlas from the University of South Florida to look by county to see what counties have the most orchids. And probably unsurprisingly, some of our counties in South Florida, which are the closest to the tropics, have the most species. So Miami-Dade County has 66 species of orchids that have been vouchered or collected there. Collier County with 56. And the other counties from the peninsula up to the Panhandle are sitting around 15 to 30 or so. You know, you got to take these numbers with a pinch of salt because there's some counties where people collect less often. I want to give a shout out to Seminole County, which has 18 orchid species collected in Seminole County, which is the same as my home county of Flagler County. So, you know, we're doing pretty good. And yeah, so I thought this was pretty interesting. Okay, so as I kind of said at the start, I think that to get an appreciation for how special Florida's orchids are, we do have to talk a little bit about taxonomy. And if we're going to talk about taxonomy, we have to talk about the naming or the nomenclature. So I've been lucky to have talked to a lot of orchid aficionados and orchid scientists in my lifetime. And you find that there are some vestiges left over from the past. For example, if you were to ask my dad, what is the scientific name of the Florida butterfly orchid, he would say Encyclia tampensi, which was the older name for it. Now it's called Encyclia tampensis. You know, it's kind of a small difference, right? But the names do change a lot in the orchids. And if you are using any kind of resources, you might encounter a significant number that have different names. And of course, with common names too, the common names sometimes are not universally accepted, or some orchids have no common names. So a big part of botany in general is just what the name is, what do you call it, how do you talk about it with other people. So I just want to put that out there as a little disclaimer that, you know, some of these names may change, caution. So why is it changing so much? So we're in the era of molecular phylogenomics and phylogenetics. So we are now using large samples of DNA to try to understand the relationships of different organisms. You know, orchids are definitely in that as well. So as we kind of elucidate those relationships better, we have a list of rules that we have to follow, or best practices that will kind of guide how things get named. So in this era, a lot of things are moving around the tree of life, and our understanding about them is changing. So it's always a good workout with the orchids for your nomenclature and your priority rules. So yeah, this is a hot topic. Encyclia tampensi, Encyclia tampensis, that's one. Here's another example where Spiranthes lanceolata variety paluticola, which is the Fakahatchee leafless lady's tresses, that changed the genus to Sacoila. And now in Weekly, you'll see it without a variety and just as Sacoila paluticola. Here's a couple others that changed. Polyrhiza lindenii, if you look at earlier references, you might see it listed as that. Now we know that is Dendrophylax lindenii, which is the ghost orchid. But one kind of interesting thing about this is that sometimes if you wait around long enough, then it actually does come back around and the name you were using comes back into fashion again. So good example of that is the green fly orchid Epidendrum canopsium, which we thought for a while was more correctly Epidendrum magnoliae. This is because of some really technical issue with when it was published and who published it first, under what name. It's kind of dry. It's a little interesting, but now it is accepted again as Epidendrum canopsium. So, back in fashion. And last bit of the kind of the dry taxonomy portion of this is just to say that with 25,000 orchids, we have to have a way to classify them in a subgrouping system. So I might be mentioning the next 20 minutes or so some other classifications other than the genus or the species. So for example, subfamily. We have 5 subfamilies within the orchid family. And then subfamilies are split into tribes, and tribes are further split into subtribes, which each have a genus and a species. So if you remember your Linnaean hierarchy of taxonomy, orchids are adding in more into that because we just love to give ourselves more work to do. Okay, and because I mentioned the subfamilies and how there's 5 subfamilies of the orchids, you don't really have to worry about what those are, but just to kind of see in that broadest, most fundamental grouping how many are represented in Florida, we have most of them in Florida. The vanilloids, which include vanilla, pogonia, things like that. The orchidoids, which include the lady's tresses, the habanera and the platanthera orchids, and the epidendroids, which include a lot of our epiphytic orchids. We have those. One thing, sadly, we don't have are the lady slippers, the cypripedidoids. Florida and Hawaii are the only states that don't have any lady slippers. That's a little bit sad, but yeah, you'll have to go to Georgia to see those. Okay. Now, looking at the genera of orchids that we have in the United States, by the numbers again, we see that the ladies' tresses orchids, or sporanthes, are the most well represented with 17 species. And kind of tailing that are the platanthera orchids, which I'll show a little bit later, with 8 species. Epidendrum, which are all epiphytic orchids, those have 7 species. If you look a little bit broader at the different orchid tribes, the sporanthoid orchids, so these are mostly rosette-forming orchids, basal rosette, terrestrial orchids. Those have 26 out of 109 of our native orchids, and so on and so forth. So one aspect of Florida's orchid flora that makes it very interesting is how we have some of the only representatives of some of the largest groups of orchids in a global sense. I'll tell you what I mean by that. So in the bottom right, there's a photo of an oncidium orchid. You might see these at the store or sometimes at specialty greenhouses. It's a tropical orchid with yellow or white flowers usually. So there's 1,000 species of oncidium or the related orchids worldwide, and we have 7 of those in Florida, and no other U.S. state has but even 1 of them. So I think that's kind of interesting. Bulbophyllum. So don't worry about the names too much, but think about those numbers. So Bulbophyllum is one of the largest genera of plants in the entire world. There's 2,000 species, and we had one of them in Florida, although whether it exists here or not is kind of up for debate. Epidendrum, as I mentioned, there's almost 1,500 species of these worldwide, and we have 7 in Florida. The pleurophthalid orchids, which Carlisle Lure worked on a lot, have 4,000 species worldwide. It's one of the largest groups of orchids, and we have 3 of them in Florida. And of course, none of them are found even outside of South Florida in the United States. And Vanda, you sometimes see these in the stores as well, kind of like big purple flowers. There are 2,000 species in that tribe. of orchids, and we have 4 of them in Florida. So I kind of think this is a little interesting. These large groups are actually represented in Florida, but out of these, only Epidendrum is found anywhere outside of Florida, looking at the United States only. Okay, so getting into some of the other components of our orchids. The orchids that are found nowhere else in the world. So, of course, these are probably some of the jewels of our orchid world, right? Because you can only find these within the state. So we have about 5 or 6 of these, 2 Trifora, 2 Spiranthes, and a couple others. These are not the kind of things that you'll probably see on your hike. They're pretty rare. Almost all of these are very rare. They have other species that look similar to them. So, you know, it might not be likely that you go find these tomorrow, but they are here. So Trifora craighedii is a really interesting one. It's a group of orchids that I actually study right now because they have very strong associations with fungi. They're also very, very tiny, and you can see my hand here next to one. This was in Citrus County. They were first described in 1965, only found in a couple of counties in Florida, and they were named for Frank Craighead, which was he was a biologist at the Everglades National Park. So this is one that's found nowhere else except for Florida. Here's another one that actually has a connection back to my lab. Spiranthes triloba, or the panther lady's tresses. It has a really nice common name. It has kind of a complicated history where it was first described in the 19th century from Lee County, but over time, various people were saying, I don't know if I really consider this to be its own species. I think it should go with this other orchid, or I think it's the same thing as this other orchid. So it was moving around, and it didn't really have a home. It was not considered to be its own thing. But finally, out of the Cameron lab, my lab right now, the phylogenetic analysis, the DNA analysis, resurrected this taxon and is recognizing it as its own distinct thing. And it is now another endemic orchid to Florida. It is one of the prettiest ladies' tresses orchids that we have. It's the only endemic one we have that you might actually see because it's not like exceedingly rare. So yeah, I think it's kind of an interesting story. Now, one interesting thing about Florida is that because of our location in between the tropics and the rest of the United States, we are at the physiological limit. We're at the limit of what these orchids can take for those that are tropical in distribution and those that are temperate, right? So for our tropical orchids, most of them only just barely make it into Florida in the hammocks, the hardwood hammocks and the sloughs, you know, the really tropical looking forests that you find in South Florida. And because they're already at the limit of what they can handle, it makes them rare, first of all, but also it makes them very susceptible to any kind of disastrous disturbances. So, you know, if you talk to people in the know about orchids, you know, they'll mention hurricanes like Donna or Andrew and how those affected what species might be here. They might have blown in from a hurricane and maybe another hurricane blew them right out. They're sensitive to other ongoing issues we have in Florida, like sea level rise, wastewater effluent from sugarcane production, and even some of the freezes that we occasionally get in South Florida, as well as poaching. So poaching is a big problem with orchids. So all these orchids that are already at their limit, at the end of their range, you know, they can very easily be knocked out. So that's why it's kind of cool in a way that some species have only just barely been seen in Florida, maybe once or twice, and never seen again. Maybe they were not going to ever be established. Maybe they just barely got established and then something kicked them away, like a hurricane. And then, of course, sometimes it may be a misidentification or something like that too. A couple that I have here, these are all epiphytic orchids that are of tropical affinity: Tetramica, Leochilus, and Restrepiella. All of these have been seen like maybe once or twice, and now they may be extirpated or locally extinct from Florida. And I have a couple others on this page too. Now, all of these have their own story behind them, which, if you're interested, you should look these up on the Florida Flora and Ecosystematics Facebook page, where Roger Hammer especially does a really great job of recounting some of the individual stories about these. But you can see that these are all pretty freaky looking plants. They're all tropical, and they have been cited in Florida in the past. Whether that is a misidentification or not, it's kind of up for debate. There's that bulbophyllum in the middle that I mentioned as part of that large group of orchids, 4,000 species, rat tail looking thing. So yeah, these are some of the orchids that may be extirpated from the state. They may no longer exist here. Maybe if we wait another 200 years, maybe one of them will blow back in. I do hear occasionally about some collaborations that may or not be happening to reintroduce a few of these from other parts of their range back into Florida. I'm still waiting to hear exactly how those go. But yeah, so these are some interesting components of our flora. One interesting one to kind of dive a little bit deeper into is the species called Govenia floridana, which was first discovered by Craig Head, who I mentioned before with his own orchid Triflora craigheadii, right? He discovered it in the Everglades in 1957. The site that it was located in was damaged following Hurricane Donna, but actually when Carlisle Lure and maybe Craig Head went back to go look for it, they actually found that it was still there for a while. But since then, it seems to have kind of flattened the population out. There have been recent sightings of it, but they're unconfirmed or even doubtful. So this is being treated based off of the earlier collection made of it as an endemic species, so only found in Florida, although we can't really confirm that with the preservation of the plant that we have in the herbarium. But if it was truly endemic and it is now completely gone from Florida, that would mean that this is an extinct plant. However, if we treat it as being a part of a larger species that stretches into the Bahamas and Cuba and things like that, then it would just be locally extirpated from Florida. Interestingly, too, the closest relatives of this species are all weird orchids like Calypso, Plectrum, and Tipularia, the fairy slipper, the putty root, and the cranefly orchid, which all have very distinctive leaves, and Corallarhiza, which is a parasitic orchid of fungi. So it's in a really weird group. I would love to see it. It's too bad it probably is extinct. Unfortunate. Now, just like we have those orchids that just barely make it up into Florida and then maybe just as soon as they're here, they leave, we also have some that have come here and they have stayed and they have found a way to live their life here just fine. There's a lot of interest in this kind of thing because, as I mentioned before, orchids have very specific associations with fungi, which you might think makes it harder for them to be introduced into a new place. But we found that there's some interesting things going on there, actually, which I can get into another time. But we have introduced orchids that are both unintentionally introduced, maybe brought in with potting soil or something that was imported or other plants that were imported. And we also have things that escaped from gardens and greenhouses. And sometimes these orchids just establish themselves in one small area and they don't really expand their range. But we actually have some cases where orchids have greatly expanded their range, even in the last couple of decades after a single introduction. Sometimes a little bit of detective work has to go on here to see whether they were actually native or introduced. One of the orchids that I study, Triflora gentianoides, the gentian nodding cap, is a common species you find growing in mulch in South Florida, now up to Central Florida. It's a little bit of controversy whether it's actually introduced or not. So there's some things like that, but most of them we're pretty certain are introduced. But less certain are we about what their ecological impact is on native plants. So for a lot of these, that remains to be seen. I listed out a couple of the introduced orchids here, but here are some photos. So this species on the left, the lawn orchid, which is Zeuxine stratomatica, that was introduced from East Asia, and now it is found throughout Florida. It is even spread to Hawaii. It's now in California. It's found elsewhere in the South. So this is a very successful orchid. At the University of Florida, I see it all over all of the mulch and everything. It really loves lawns. So we're kind of getting into the period of time when you can see it. Keep an eye out in your lawn for Zeuxine when we get to November, December. Another really ubiquitous one, and I think I've even seen this at some of the hammocks in Seminole County, Oceoclades maculata, or the monk orchid, introduced from Africa, West Africa. It has now expanded its range from Miami-Dade County all the way up through even to Gainesville. And not only that, but also all throughout South America. So this is one that really has expanded its range really greatly. And one of the most tenacious orchids, really, like in terms of where it can grow, is the crown orchid, the Chinese crown orchid, Eulophia graminea, which has been introduced in the last couple decades from East Asia. It has expanded its range all the way up to St. Johns County. And if there was one that really is giving a negative effect, I would wager it's probably this species, because you can find it growing in some pretty sensitive habitats like the pine rocklands of South Florida. This photo I took in the Everglades. That's one to keep an eye on. It's a potentially even more wide-ranging species. But we'll turn now, talk about some of the native species and what their affinities are. Where did they come from? So if you look at our 109 native taxa of orchids, about 60 of them are from the neotropics, which we would consider to be the Caribbean, South and Central America. I listed a few off there. 40 of them or so are mainly North American, and especially Eastern North America and the coastal plains, which are the low-lying regions of the Gulf Coast, so going from Florida to parts of Texas, so Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and then from Florida along the Atlantic coast through Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and even a little bit of New Jersey is considered part of the Atlantic coastal plain. So a lot of our orchids have a distribution that encompasses either Eastern North America on the coastal plains or Caribbean and South America. There's also a couple orchids that are pan-tropical, which means that they're stretching across all of the tropics of the world. So here's an example of one of those orchids that's pan-tropical. The older name for this was Liparis nervosa, or the tall tway blade. You can find it in some of the hammocks of South Florida. This is a map from GBIF, which is like an aggregator of observations from collections of plants. And all of those yellow dots are a place where it has been collected in the past. And you can see that it just barely reaches into Florida, but it covers all of the Caribbean, a lot of South America, Africa, Madagascar, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia. And it's thought to be native to all those places. So we would call that pan-tropical. And also interestingly, this is one of the species that's semi-epiphytic. So a lot of its relatives are all terrestrial, but this one can sometimes grow on top of logs and things like that. So it's a survivor. It's a pretty cool one. Another one that's pantropical is Polystachya concreta, or the helmet orchid. This one is an epiphyte, and it's one of the more common epiphytic orchids that you'll see if you're in South Florida. I've definitely seen it in Collier, Dade County, Monroe County. If you go to any places that have a lot of orchids, you may see this. It has kind of an interesting flower that has a bit of a hooded thing that looks like a helmet on it. And if you see the entire inflorescence, it makes almost like a Christmas tree. You can't really see the Christmas tree in this too well, but if you look at some other pictures, you'll maybe see it. Again, this one also Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. This is one of the vandoid orchids. So this is related to Vanda, one of the popular orchids that you find in stores and stuff. It's also related weirdly to the ghost orchid. So that's kind of cool. Now, there's a couple orchids that we have that span North America and Central America. So here are two coral root orchids. You'll notice that these have no leaves. They're not green, so they are partially or completely dependent on fungi for their carbon, which you need carbon to build your entire self, right? Everything is made with carbon. So these are kind of the leechers of the orchid world. They steal all the carbon or most of the carbon that they need to build themselves. And they also have kind of an interesting distributional pattern. So Coralorhiza wisteriana, the spring coral root, that is found in Florida, the eastern United States, the Rockies, and Mexico. It's kind of interesting. And then the autumn coral root, Coralorhiza odontorhiza, which is starting to bloom here in Wisconsin, is barely found in Florida, but all over the eastern US, all the way up to Canada, as well as Mexico. So with such a close relationship with fungi, you would think that would be limiting the range that it can possess. But there's been a lot of interesting research coming out lately about exactly how the fungi they associate with these orchids can actually modulate what that range is like and what preferences they can tolerate. So really cool stuff going on with these two orchids found in Florida. Now I want to get into some of the other genera, and this is kind of the pretty picture time of the talk where I'm going to introduce some of our familiar genera, a couple ones maybe you haven't seen before, and talk a little bit about their distribution. But I'm going to be going pretty quickly through this. So if you see something that you like, feel free to send me an email about it later, or look it up with some of the resources I'll have at the end. So Calopogon, these are the grass pinks. We have 4 species in Florida. 5 of them are worldwide. And we only have 1 species not found here, which is found in like the Ozarks and the central US. We do have our own weird variety of the tuberous grass pink on the left, which is found in South Florida. That's variety Simpsonii. You can find these growing from winter to summer, blooming winter to summer, in flatwoods, wet ditches, wet prairies, pretty much throughout the state. 2 of these photos are from the Panhandle. One of them is from Martin County. Some of them are highly fire dependent, which is interesting. So these are the grass pinks, which, by the way, we get these in Wisconsin too. Calopogon tuberosus on the left is one of the most wide-ranging orchids. Spiranthes, which I mentioned before, is one of the largest, or it is the largest genus of orchids found in Florida. We have 17 in Florida, and there are about 40 of them worldwide. That includes Asia. There's some in Europe, but most of them are found in the United States. Most of our Spiranthes have an affinity with the southeastern U.S. or the eastern U.S. in general. So This middle one, Spiranthes tuberosa, can be found all the way up into kind of some of the central states. And that's pretty typical for a lot of the Spiranthes. You can also find these blooming from winter to summer, not really any of them in the fall, weirdly, growing in wet prairies, ditches, flatwoods, the side of the road. The orchid on the right side, Spiranthes vernalis, the spring lady's tresses. It's one of the most common species in Florida that you'll encounter. Just look for any unmowed roadside in the spring around April, and you may find that one. Telling the different Spiranthes apart is a little bit difficult. Some of the features you look for are the inside of the flower, like what color the throat is, whether it has fragrance or not. Excuse me. Let me take a sip of water. So whereas Spiranthes, the lady's tresses, are mainly North American, we have a lot of orchids in that tribe, the Spiranthoid tribe, which are completely opposite. They have a tropical affinity, and they only just barely make it into Florida. And for various reasons, they're also some of our most overlooked species. So here I have 3 of them. The copper lady's tresses, speckled lady's tresses, Costa Rican lady's tresses. They are all more tropical in distribution. So you can see maybe only 1 or a couple dots in Florida, but definitely all over Central America and the Caribbean for these. One of the coolest of these are the leafless lady's tresses. When they bloom, their leaves have kind of died back. Sequoia lanceolata, which you can find in roadsides in Central Florida, and Sequoia pallidosa, which you can find in the very dense hardwood hammocks of South Florida, are 2 in this species. They're very cool. But they also are threatened in our state. This is a photo my dad took a couple decades ago in Lee County of a really beautiful patch of Spiranthes lanceolata. Unfortunately, this was paved over to make a road. This was probably before it was a protected species, but still in Volusia County, I know that the Orchid Society up there puts up little signs to tell the mowers, don't mow here, because you can easily mow down an entire population of these. Okay, getting into one of the epiphytic genera, we have Epidendrum. So you don't have to worry about what these species are, but there's 7 maps on here where it is green or yellow. Those are the counties it occurs in. So you can see 6 of these are only in Florida, as far as the United States is concerned, and only 1 of them in the middle gets outside of Florida, and that happens to be the only epiphytic orchid that's found outside of Florida, Epidendrum canopsium. This is 7 out of 1,500 found globally, distributed from Argentina all the way up to North Carolina. Here's some Epidendrum. On the right, Epidendrum canopsium, you can find that in Seminole County, again, all the way up to North Carolina. All the rest of them are limited no farther north than South Florida. Epidendrum nocturnum is one of my favorites. Very tropical. A few other epiphytic ones just to look at really quickly. The cowhorn orchid, Cyrtopodium punctatum, and the mule ear orchid, Trichocentrum undulatum. Both of these can be found very rare in South Florida. I think that they have unique looking pseudobulbs and leaves. On that Trichocentrum, has very thick leaves that are folded in half. Gives it a very unique look. So unfortunately, these are often targets of poaching. You know, something to be aware of, that this is something that still happens. Interesting one that's found in Martin and St. Lucie County is Tolumnia bahamensis, the Florida dancing lady. This has a very unique habitat as far as orchids in Florida are concerned. It grows kind of at the base of these rosemary shrubs in some of the scrubby areas. So you can see the habitat here. There's all this reindeer lichen. But but when they bloom, they have a spectacular display. So this is a pretty cool, unique orchid. Also increasingly very, very rare here. Here's some of our leafless orchids. On the right is Dendrophylax lindenii, the ghost orchid, which is one of the most famous of all of the Florida orchids. There is a couple others that also have no leaves, though, and you might ask, how does it live with no leaves? The roots have chlorophyll on them, so they're able to photosynthesize with their roots. So, if you just see this in the forest, if you don't know what you're looking for, you might not really look twice at this. But all of these are pretty special species. And of course, there's our ghost orchid. My dad took this photo, kind of an unusual angle, I think. But yeah, there you go. Okay, one that's in the Panhandle and just barely getting into Central Florida is the cranefly orchid, or Tipularia discolor. Unique thing about this orchid is that it is wintergreen, so the leaves stay up over the winter. They're very flat on the ground. It produces one leaf per little tuber thing, and it has a distribution that's mostly in the eastern, southeastern United States. So cool species. It blooms in the summer. We'll keep going. Just a couple more to look at. The vanilloid orchids is what my lab works on here at UW-Madison. So I want to give a quick shout out to my lab mate, Grant Morton, who is studying vanilla in Florida. And he's specifically trying to study how to culture vanilla orchids and what their preferences are in terms of the fungal microbiome, the fungi that live inside of them, to see how we can actually culture these and maybe bring some of the populations back up. So Grant Morton is working on that right now. Two other really interesting species that we have are Clystesiopsis divaricata and Pogonia ophioglossoides, the large spreading pogonia and the rose pogonia. And all of these have different distributions. So Clystesiopsis is mainly southeastern coastal plain, like we talked about before. Leafy vanilla, and really all the vanillas are pretty much restricted to the tropics, barely reaching into South Florida. And Pogonia ophioglossoides, that's one of those superstars that goes all the way from Florida all the way to Canada. So I get that in Wisconsin, and it kind of reminds me of home, which is great. So many orchids, unfortunately, so little time. On the left is Triflora trianthophoros, the three-bird orchid. This is one of the orchids that I study, and I study specifically its relationships with fungi. So many weird things about this one. It all blooms. Colonies are large and they all bloom at one time. Flowers stay open only for one day. There are understory herbs with very tiny leaves. You wonder, how are they even able to get the energy they need, considering how little time they spend above the ground. Maybe in a couple of years I'll come back and I'll tell you a little bit of a longer story about that one after my thesis is done. And two others on here, Malaxis unifolia and Euphlophia alta. Just beautiful, right? Look at just the diversity of shapes and forms in their flowers and leaves and things, right? It's incredible. Habenaria and Platanthera, both of these are well represented in Florida. 8 species of Platanthera. They're mostly northern hemisphere temperate plants. Habenaria, 5 species, warm, found throughout the world. All sorts of habitats, you can find them in Florida, hammocks, brushy places. That Habenaria floribunda, the rain orchid on the right, you can find that growing as a weed in Central Florida sometimes, just in anywhere brushy. I couldn't do an orchid talk without, our gorgeous Platanthera species. Over here we have Platanthera cristata, Platanthera chapmanii. On the right is Platanthera conspicua, or Blephara glottis, variety conspicua, depending on who you ask. On the bottom right, Platanthera ciliaris, which is one of the orchids that got me into orchids as a study. Just gorgeous plants. These are mostly butterfly pollinated. And again, there are so many other orchids that we could talk about, but I'm already, at almost an hour. So I'm going to turn you loose with just some resources for you to use to learn a little bit more about them. As you're going through this, think about some of the things that we looked at today. What is the distribution of them? Is it tropical? Is it temperate? Does it just grow in Florida and Cuba? What's going on with them? Think about what the taxonomic affinities are. Is it in a group that is barely represented in Florida, or is it something that you find all over the United States? I think by looking more into those kind of things, you kind of get to a higher level of appreciation for just how unique these plants are. So, of course, the tome is Carlisle Lohr's Native Orchids of Florida. Paul Martin Brown, who we recently lost, has a series of books. Wild Orchids of Florida is one of them. You got to check out Prem's website, Florida's Native and Naturalized Orchids, which is a great resource. Roger Hammer, another great resource. If you're looking at the United States flora in general for orchids, the North American Orchid Conservation Center has a site, Go Orchids, which has profiles for all of our species of North American orchids north of Mexico. And shout out to the Florida Flora and Ecosystematics Facebook page. Floyd and Edwin, Roger, everybody who's on there does a really great job of teaching and sharing, and it's just a really positive and great place to go to. So I'll plug that. And of course, your local native plant chapter. Again, thanks, Mark, and everybody. Long live plants, and that's all I got. I'll take some questions now. Here's my email.
I guess I need to add myself to the stream. Thank you, Brandon. Appreciate it. It's looking pretty quiet right now. Folks, this is a good time to comment. If you have questions, we have a person that is so knowledgeable on orchids. So if you have questions, ID questions, identification questions, or if you are in South Florida and you want to know, hey, what are some common orchids that I can easily spot in South Florida, or if it's the same question in the Panhandle, now's a good time. And don't forget, we'll be doing a photo series courtesy of the wonderful Brandon right here in time for October Florida Native Plant Month next month. So tune in on our Facebook and Instagram. We'll showcase an orchid every day. Janelle writes, where in Daytona Beach, Volusia, can orchids be viewed? This is actually your stomping grounds. You grew up not too far away from there.
Yeah. So, some of the orchids that I mentioned, like the African monk orchid, that's one of the introduced species. You can find that most places you look. If you look in kind of the really brushy areas on the side of the forests. So, I wouldn't feel too bad about telling somebody where to go for that one, because that's not a sensitive plant. For other ones, I probably wouldn't say too much information in a public sphere like this, but for that particular species, again, introduced one, I've seen it at the Spruce Creek preserves, all sorts of things like that. But one of the native ones, the spring lady's tresses, which, kind of has a long white spike, like maybe a foot or foot and a half off the ground. You can find that one in April. It's pretty common. Look for it in the side of the road. Like I said, anywhere that's not mowed. That's one that's very reliable to see. But yeah, I would just advocate for everybody just to get out in general and just, use iNaturalist or something like that to just start taking pictures of things around you. And, you may find something that you're looking at, maybe an orchid, and you didn't even expect it to be an orchid, right? Mm-hmm. So I would advocate that too.
Yeah, and iNaturalist is good. If you find a threatened or endangered species, it does tend to mask that particular photograph's location. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking for just to view and admire an orchid without giving it away, that's a good way to go. So yeah, we got a lot of questions lined up now.
Okay, great.
RL writes, has anybody looked into the mechanisms by which Epidendrum canopsium is so much more hardy, cold hardy than other epidendrums?
That's a really good question. I do not know off the top of my head, but it is kind of an interesting area. So, you know, if you think about the latitude sense, it's true that besides Epidendrum canopsium, nothing else in our area is getting farther north than Florida, right? Except for that epidendrum. And by the way, Spanish moss, Tillandsia usnioides, is another that also has tolerance beyond Florida, right? There's very few epiphytes north of Florida. So that's from a latitudinal sense. But if you look at it not from latitudinal, but from elevation, if you go to the Andes, you'll find that there are many orchid species found in the cloud forests of the Andes, and those are definitely susceptible to very cold temperatures. I don't know exactly how cold, but they can tolerate a pretty good bit of cold. And also, if you look at, I believe, like Hong Kong and Taiwan, there's also epiphytic orchids there, and I believe that they can also withstand some cold temperatures. So yeah, not sure about Epidendrum canopsium, but there are other candidates out there that may have been studied for their physiology and their tolerance for that. That would be something cool to look into. Good question.
Nice nuanced question. Hey, PJ. PJ's with us, and she writes those ground orchids in South Florida that are not native, and all of them, I guess. Well, not all, but most. So, do they get around? How are they transported? Are they transported through wild animal fur, or is it wind mostly?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I wouldn't. So they don't have any specific adaptations to cling to fur that I know of. And there absolutely are some plants that you find that will stick to you, right? Like certain things in the bean family have very sticky fruit, like Velcro. So these seeds are so small that I don't know of anything that is going to attach them like that. But I couldn't put it past them just being so dust-like that maybe they get on something and get transported that way. I believe though that it should predominantly be through wind that they're transported, those seeds. Yeah.
Next question is, does the relationship between orchids and fungi mycelia, do they tell a deeper co-evolutionary story? Oh man, you could go down the rabbit hole with this one.
Yeah, this is another one. This sounds like a question my committee would be giving me, my PhD committee. Yeah, well, if you look, and I'm going to put my paleobotany hat on a little bit because that's kind of where I started before I did orchids. The plant and fungal relationship has been documented in the fossil record, going back hundreds of millions of years. So, it's not just the orchids. I want to say something like 90% of plant families associate with fungi. Now, it is true that you won't find very many families that have as tight and as integral a relationship as the orchids do with fungi. So, that is something that all 25,000 orchids do share. But yeah, I wonder this a lot, whether the fungal component of it might be driving some aspect of its speciation. One thing I didn't really talk about, but something that's very interesting is this paradox of how do we have so many orchid species? And the reason why that's kind of a paradox is because we think that the dust-like seeds of orchids, allow them to get all over the place. But for species or for any kind of organism that can really spread very far, it actually is thought to work against driving speciation or the creation of new species, because they're able to breed with each other, and more of the older ones are coming in, and it's not allowing enough differentiation. In order to have a new species, you need to have some kind of differentiation. So, it is kind of interesting question about, maybe something to do with the fungal component might be a limiting factor, and maybe that is driving more differentiation somehow. That's all speculation, but yeah, there could be a deeper story there.
For sure. Good question, Stephen. Joanne writes, do native orchids primarily occur in sun or shade?
Yeah, and this is also another question that I feel like is right out of my committee. So this is great practice for me. Well, what I would say is, to plug what I'm researching, I research orchids that can photosynthesize and also parasitize fungi. So when you're photosynthesizing, you're taking in carbon dioxide, carbon from the air, and through a series of reactions, you're incorporating that into sugar. That's one way to get sugar. The other way is to get it from a fungus, just to steal it from a fungus, right? So you're doing the same thing, but through different routes. So for plants that grow in the sun, you would think that they're just fine getting all their energy from the sun through photosynthesis. But for plants that are found in the shade, that they may need to offset some of that carbon from a fungus instead. So where this comes in with the orchids is that we already know that all orchids have a very close relationship with fungi. So they already have that ability to take energy from a fungus to start with. So that allows a lot of them to grow in very dense shade. So I mentioned the Triflora, Trianthophoros, the three birds orchid. That's one that has very tiny leaves but can grow in shade just fine. A lot of the terrestrial species that live in the Everglades or the Fakahatchee, anywhere that has these hardwood hammocks, they can live in the shade just fine. But then I also mentioned a lot of species that grow on the side of the road in open prairies or wet prairies, meadows, lawns. So really it kind of can be either, but there is an interesting reason why it's either, which is, as I just said. So that's a good question too.
Very good. PJ wanted to ask, is there a endangered orchid propagation organization?
There is, and there's several. And it's a lot of different groups. So this is happening at botanical gardens. So, Fairchild Botanical Gardens and Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, at museums, at universities. So, the Smithsonian is doing propagation and studies on orchid requirements. I mentioned my lab mate, Grant Morton, who's studying vanilla, and, that's with the eye towards propagation of endangered species. In some universities in Texas. At the University of Florida, they do a lot of propagation. So yeah, tons of people are. I'll give a shout out to, I think it's Michael Kane, C-A-N-E, or K-A-N-E, at Florida, who was propagating ghost orchids at the University of Florida in the environmental horticulture department. So I went to go see them, and all these little ghost orchids and these little Tupperwares that they grew. It's pretty incredible. So yeah, lots of that's happening.
Awesome. Just to buckle up, Brandon, the questions aren't quitting.
Oh, no, that's great. I mean, orchids really excite the mind, right?
Yes, it's a very well received presentation.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's the Jingle Bell orchid.
Yes. Do you know who is studying the Jingle Bell orchid, Dendrophylax?
Yeah, so Anne, I could not give you a name of anybody off the top of my head. But, I have heard the same thing that you mentioned. So Anne is talking about this leafless orchid. It used to be called Heracella perectus. Now it's called Dendrophylax perecta, which is the same genus as the ghost orchid. It has no leaves. It was commonly found growing on like orange groves, especially when they're abandoned. So, go figure how that happened. Orchids are so incredible, right? But yeah, so I know the story, but I don't know who, if anybody, is working on that right now. But I don't know if somebody here is looking for a master's, maybe maybe you want to look into that.
That's right. That's right. They are fairly common here in Central Florida, and
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I mean, you have to look really close sometimes, especially cedars.
Hmm.
Those tend to host them
Hmm.
quite a bit, and if they have the right circumstances, like moist, shaded areas,
Hmm.
chances are you'll be surprised to find one.
And the jingle
Gail,
bell orchid too. It's a twig epiphyte, so they have kind of a short life cycle and they live on twigs. It's one of a couple of our orchids that are specialized on twigs, which is kind of cool.
yes, yeah, I think that's cool too. Pretty nondescript
Hmm.
orchid.
Yes.
Um, Gail writes, do we have any of the orchids that grow on rocks in Florida?
Yeah, definitely. So, again, there's so many species that I wish I could have got to, but somehow I actually got in exactly at an hour. So, maybe it's good I didn't start adding many more pictures. But one that comes to mind that I did mention is one of the spiranthoid orchids, so related to spiranthes, the lady's tresses. And that was the copper lady's tresses, which is called Mesodenus leucayanus. That one you can find growing directly on rocks occasionally. So I've found it in various places in central Florida growing, on limestone, like in like sinks, where you have some sinkholes and stuff. Um, I believe there's a few other ones. I might be incorrect on this, but there's this orchid called Galliandra bicaucerata, that grows in South Florida. I believe it also grows on limestone. So yeah, we do have a few of those.
So, like karst specialists, is that
Yeah,
the,
karst or rockland hammock. A lot of orchids in the United States seem to enjoy calcareous, calcium-rich places. I was just up in Door County, Wisconsin, which is on the Niagara Escarpment. It's all dolomite there. So many orchids up there. So I think that some parts of Florida with karst have more orchids than you might expect. So Citrus County, Levy County, parts of Alachua County, they are very rich for where they are. You might not expect. Yeah.
interesting? Osceola County question: what type of orchids would one commonly find there?
Yeah. Now, I'm going to have to refresh myself on the preserves that they have in Osceola County. Mark, do you know of some of the big ones? Because I
Um,
remember it based off of the state park.
yeah, I mean, uh, I would assume Disney's the
Hmm.
Wilderness Preserve is out there. There was a huge parcel of land, I think that was owned by the Subway family, that was
Okay.
donated to the University of Florida.
Okay.
That's new.
So
Not
I
all.
have so Joanne, I have pulled up on my screen, and I'll just kind of look through this really quick. Osceola County from the Atlas of Florida Plants. It says that there are 24 species that have been collected there. It includes some we just talked about, like the Christmas orchid Dendrophylax perectus, the Florida butterfly orchid, which I had in my last slide, and Cyclia tampensis is there. Some of the Platanthera species that we showed, the really beautiful orange flowered ones, the calipogons, all of the calipogons we have in Florida grow in Osceola County. What I'm seeing based off of the list I have here is anywhere that has a wet meadow, anything that has a flat woods, kind of like a lot of sable palmetto and pines and stuff. Those are the kind of places you want to look. And that's what it seems like the species there prefer.
Very good. Um, PJ follows up with another question: do most plants require bacteria to assimilate nutrients from the soil? So are orchids utilizing fungi because they're simpler organisms than bacteria? Fungi are often on woody things. Orchids are
Mhm.
woody. our orchids
Yeah,
really?
so a lot of interesting things in there. So a couple things to say. So orchids associate not just with fungi, but with all sorts of other different organisms. The only thing is that we don't know 100% of the time what those other organisms are doing. So, for example, if you cut into a root of an orchid, you'll see a lot of fungi in there. But if you look at the stem of an orchid, you may find fungi and bacteria and other stuff in there as well. So it's considered to be the microbiome of a plant, right? And all plants have this to some extent. So we only are just beginning to really understand everything about the plant microbiome. Um, we do have a better understanding, though, of how the fungi work. And it seems like the fungi that the orchids associate with are often fungi that are decomposers of things in the environment, for one. So it may be something that's breaking wood apart. Now, that would mean that the carbon from the orchid that's taking it, if it is indeed doing that, which, they do it at their juvenile stage, but some of them might not do it when they're adults, right? But the carbon that the orchid is taking up, it may have originally come from a dead tree that a fungus broke down, and then the orchid stole that carbon from the fungus, right? So that's one way. Another way would be fungi that are mutually associating with other trees, mycorrhizal fungi. So some of the parasitic orchids will tap into the mycorrhizal network under the soil. So in that case, the carbon didn't come from something dead that was broken down, but the carbon came from a tree or another plant that was photosynthesizing. That plant traded it with the fungus, so to speak, and then the orchid stole it from the fungus. So there's multiple different sources of the carbon, and that reflects the diversity of the different fungi that they associate with and what those
Amazing.
fungi are doing.
Amazing. So yeah, your fan mail keeps coming in. Janelle writes, "Thank you." Florida Boar, who's Barbara, she's one of our members. She writes, "Thank you, Brandon." PJ gives you a round of applause and writes, "Thank you."
I wear my orchid shirt today.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
And I also have my orchid mask. This is a Cypripedium. This is a lady's slipper that's found in Wisconsin.
Amazing.
Yeah, we went all orchid today.
Brandon, you're jumping on the craze where your mask matches your outfit.
Exactly. With orchids is easy, right?
Oh man. Well, thank you guys. This actually concludes our program for tonight. It was very well received as usual, Brandon. So don't be a stranger. We'll probably see you again after January. And for those of you who want to revisit Brandon's program with us, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's just youtube.com/cup-of-fern. If you want to join the Native Plant Society, please go to fnps.org/join. We recommend you actually make a difference in your locale. So if you're in South Florida, join a South Florida chapter that serves your county. But if you are a distance learner, then you can select Cup-of-Fern, and we'd be happy to tag you along on our native plant journey. You can always find us on Facebook and Instagram. And that concludes it with Darlene saying thank you. So thank you, Brandon. Have a lovely evening, and round of applause to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
All right, take care.
Good to be here.